welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff, which I hope you're going to enjoy. I want to introduce you to Katie Langston, but I want to do it in a little bit of a unique way, and that is the way that I was first introduced to this just powerful voice of faith. And that was in the 2018 Protect LDS Children's March in Salt Lake City, before the survivors and supporters of reform on the subject of worthiness interviews marched down Temple Avenue to get to the church office building. There was a rally held, and survivors, mental health professionals, and clergy were invited to speak on the subject of worthiness interviews. And in the midst of all that cacophony, this really powerful voice stood out, certainly to me, and it was something that I incorporated in some of the media that went afterwards, after the march itself. But I want to introduce you to Katie Langston through that talk, which we will bring up on the screen now.
Good afternoon. My name is Katie Langston, and it's an honor to be here today. I approach this issue from multiple...
I'm not sure why it did that.
Good afternoon. My name is Katie Langston, and it's an honor to be here today. I approach this issue from multiple perspectives. First, personally, I was raised a devout Mormon, but in a place where I should have been protected and taught that I was loved, my church experience was full of anxiety and shame. As a girl of 13, my bishop pulled me into a room and asked me very, very detailed personal and sexual questions. It traumatized me. I always feared worthiness.
Come on, YouTube, don't let us down. Pause, play. Okay, well, we're having technical times with YouTube. I'm just going to hit refresh on this and see if a refresh will allow us to continue where we left off. And we'll fast forward to that moment.
Protected and taught that I was loved, my church experience was full of anxiety and shame. As a girl of 13, my bishop pulled me into a room and asked me very, very detailed personal and sexual questions. It traumatized me. I always feared worthiness interviews from that time on and lived with a debilitating sense of unworthiness that I still struggle with to this day. I also approach this issue as a mother. My husband and I were married in the temple soon after I returned home from my mission to Bulgaria, and we have 2 daughters who are still being raised in the Mormon church, and I fear for them. I fear for their safety, and I want to make sure that they never, ever experience anything like the shame and trauma that I did. Thirdly, I approach this issue as a pastor. 4 or 5 years ago, I experienced a call to ministry that was so overpowering that I could do nothing but follow it, and I am now a candidate for ordination in the Lutheran Church. And as I have studied, and as I have been trained in pastoral best practices and theology, I am more and more stunned that this practice of worthiness interviews continues to be perpetuated. Let me be clear. There is no place in the gospel of Jesus Christ for worthiness interviews.
Okay, so that is just a taste of what my first introduction was to Katie, and I'm so pleased to be able to have her join us today on the talk show. How are you doing, Katie?
Good. Much less fired up than I was that day.
Well, for me, that's like, I love stopping at that point where you just bring into stark contrast the gospel of Jesus Christ as so much of the wider Christian world understands it.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they don't really know that this whole worthiness practice happens, this worthiness interview practice happens in Mormonism.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a seed at the heart of that realization, which is that as Mormons, we grow up and we are told what religion is, particularly if you're born in the church. We're made familiar with the concept of religion because of the religion that we live in, and they kind of portray the entire world as just a bunch of competing people with that same authoritarian hierarchy paradigm. And so you assume that that's the way the rest of religion is. And the awakening to the fact that that's not how it is was a big part of my own journey and your own. So I want to kind of just start with there. I'm terrible at this whole introduction thing, and I've been talking too much already. But I want to make sure we start out by one of the reasons to bring you on today is that you have recently published a book. Tell us a little bit about what went into the decision to do that and the effects of that.
Sure. So the book is called Sealed, An Unexpected Journey into the Heart of Grace, and it's a memoir. It's a spiritual memoir. And to be honest, like the process of writing it was something that, I started 10 years ago, even while I was still in Mormonism. But after I'd sort of experienced a profound kind of awakening or sense of God's grace that was really then challenging everything that I'd learned and been taught growing up Mormon. And so I started writing it as a way to kind of make sense of my experience and what was happening to me and in me. And then I put it away for several years. I got about a third of the way through the book, like through my childhood. And then I realized I didn't know where the story was going because I kind of intuited that I hadn't lived it yet. So I put it away. And then when I was in, a couple years into seminary, where I'm currently almost done, I just finished my last class as a seminarian in a Lutheran seminary. I picked it back up again because I felt like, this is a story that, for my own sake, I needed to tell and I needed to write and kind of find. Kind of integrate all of my experiences. And I thought, if this process of writing this and this discovery has been helpful for me, maybe it could be helpful for some other folks. So that's why I decided to find a publisher, and here we are.
Well, I had the opportunity to experience your book not as written words on the page, but really as a very emotional and authentic performance in the form of your audiobook from Audible. So if you have an interest in not only reading, but hearing Katie talk about her journey, and there's so much more that's added by the way that she's able to give life to the words in what is really a remarkable performance. I encourage you to experience it that way. But speaking on what you mentioned in terms of documenting your journey, I found so much that resonated with my own experience, particularly starting in your youth and coming to terms with worthiness and how heavy a weight the concept of worthiness just lays on the shoulder of every Mormon youth. And it seemed like that struggling with that was a big part of not only the sort of the trauma of a Mormon childhood, plagued not only by worthiness, but pairing that with religious scrupulosity.
Yeah.
And then how those wounds make something like grace be so much more powerful force when you stumble upon it. Can you talk a little bit about how those concepts played and kind of did a little dance and transition?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of what is sort of the key transformation that I've experienced in my life. And, I think I'm not alone. I think especially, in that experience of being able to, to give that talk at the Protect the Children March and some other, public speaking or advocacy I've done about worthiness interviews, I know that I'm not the only one who experienced this sort of emphasis on worthiness as a terrible spiritual burden. And not just a spiritual burden, but a burden in the body, right? Like a sense of self-hatred for particularly like sexuality, sexual desire, those sorts of things, and experiencing intrinsic shame, just the sense that like, I'm not worthy, I won't be worthy, I'll never have done all that I can do, right? Because we're saved by grace after all we can do. And if you're honest, like, can any of us say that we've done all we can? And so it was sort of this sort of black hole of despair is how I think about it. I was convinced that I would never be worthy. And then at a point when all seemed lost, as it were, I had a profound experience or a profound awakening to this notion of grace, this concept of grace, in which I came to believe that actually worthiness was a gift from God. And it wasn't something that I had to work for. It wasn't something I had to qualify for. It wasn't something I had to pass a checklist interview in order to be declared worthy, but that by grace I had already been called worthy. And I was worthy because of that grace. And that was just a profound paradigm shift that allowed me to sort of open up, to stop being so afraid, to trust that everything was going to be okay. And that was a really important part of healing and finding hope.
Now, I don't know how much of my particular channel you may have seen in the past, but one of the things that we discuss quite frequently are mechanisms of psychological manipulation and leverage that take place in high demand religion contexts.
Yep.
And this concept of perpetual inadequacy is so ubiquitous because the ability for an organization to take normal human experiences, specifically sexuality, or even any personal failing, and then introduce the idea that you are broken because of it, and it's only through your adherence to the demands of the group that you can have the aspiration towards feeling whole, but you're never going to feel whole and complete because you're always broken. That is such a common manipulation that happens in all of these groups that it becomes a little bit of a I don't know, once you escape that in Mormonism, it's a huge red flag for whatever journey you find yourself on afterwards.
Yes.
And I think in some cases that prevents people from entertaining even any Christian paradigm at all, because just the idea that you have to be saved from something implies that there's a brokenness there, that you get that idea of brokenness as a red flag. How did you navigate those impulses? What context do you see these challenges in terms of dealing with your own personal weaknesses and failings?
Wow, that's a great question. What a thoughtful question. So a couple of things come to mind. The first is sort of in response to what you just said, John, about how the high demand groups put you in a hamster wheel. I'm paraphrasing, but they put you in a hamster wheel because of the reality that we are all broken, right? That we're not perfect, right? Human beings make mistakes. We hurt people when we don't mean to. We hurt people when we do mean to. We lie. We betray our loved ones. I mean, these are things that are part of what it means to be human on an individual level. And then if you look at the world in terms of systemic injustice, hatred, racism, the destruction of the environment. I mean, you know what I mean? Like the kinds of things that that go beyond just individual, let's say, failing, and instead create war and division and hatred in our entire culture, destruction. You look at that and you recognize that there is a brokenness in humanity, and so I guess I've never struggled with the idea that, yeah, there's some stuff that's kind of messed up about us, right? About the human condition, the way Luther talks about it, Martin Luther talks about it, is that we are simultaneously saints and sinners. That at the same time within the human person is the capacity for tremendous good and tremendous harm. So, having said that, the notion then that we have to will ourselves out of that brokenness, right, by adherence to a checklist of demands or whatever, is just plain and simple, like, ineffective, right? And so the kind of paradigm shift or the change that comes within a grace-based kind of worldview is to recognize, yeah, there's this brokenness, and I can hold and acknowledge that brokenness. I can tell the truth about it, right? I can say and acknowledge openly and honestly, yeah, there's stuff that goes on that's not right or good. At the same time, recognizing that there is peace and healing available, because even though there's this brokenness, there is also at the center of everything this profound love, this deep acceptance that exists in what I would call God. What, if you're not into that kind of thing, maybe you might call it the universe, you might call it something else. But that at the heart of everything, despite the brokenness, is a source of wholeness and peace and reconciliation and justice. And that we can name the brokenness because we understand that ultimately love is at the bottom of everything, which is a really different thing from saying that you're broken and you've got to fix it in these specific ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think regardless of whether you're in a religious context or not in a religious context, we have to deal with, our own failings of our own personal ideals.
Exactly.
You mentioned Martin Luther. It reminded me, there's this quote by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which is that the line between good and evil goes right between the heart of every human.
I love that.
And whether you're dealing with sin, as you define it in a religious context,
right,
or even dealing with the fact that, I've got these moral or ethical ideals as a person, even if I don't hold a belief in God,
right,
and I realize that I don't live up to them all the time.
Right.
And you see brokenness in the world around you, and how do you deal with that so that you don't throw yourself in the trash or throw your friends and family that don't live up to these ideals.
Right.
And one of the things that I think has become more apparent to me is that there's a form of emotional, psychological, and social maturity in a framework that elevates and preserves concepts of forgiveness, and the grace element to that, that allows you then to move past both your own individual shortcomings and those in the world around you, so that people can move forward in the wake of their own failings.
Yes.
And there are moments in Christian history where that element is lost, and where you get, mob violence, moral panic, where there's this puritanical, you must be pure, purge the unclean type of things that happen. And I've mentioned it a few times, but we're seeing even in secular moral frameworks that puritanical impulse continues to be there.
Yes.
And there's no foundation for grace and forgiveness. And so when you see somebody violating your elevated moral ideal that comes from some non-religious source, then the mode of condemnation, the mode of what people call canceling or deplatforming, saying that you no longer deserve a place in society, is an impulse that is absolutely lacking in grace and forgiveness.
Absolutely.
And so I feel like there's a need for those concepts to, even if you're not religious in your framework of the world, those are still very important societal concepts, because no matter, utopianism is a place that can never be reached because it doesn't exist. What's your take on that and those impulses? Do you see them also happening in the world around us?
I absolutely see them. And it's, my mind went to that same place that you went. There's sort of this, I think, especially in like post-Mormonism, this sort of backlash against all religion. It's like, well, religion does this, and religion says that there's like good and evil and sin, or sin, and I'm just going to throw out that whole framework. But then it's like, well, I don't know. I'm on Twitter, and Twitter isn't a particularly religious place, and yet there is still this impulse to demand purity, and that in and of itself is part of the brokenness of the human condition, right? That the desire to condemn and to police the boundaries and those sorts of things in coercive ways, I think, like is deeply embedded in, as part of what I would say maybe the sinner part of the sinner and saint dichotomy, that we demand purity in others because we're so afraid of the impurity we see in ourselves. And so absolutely, I think that applying principles of grace, of forgiveness, a recognition of the inability of human beings to perfectly live up to their ideals is really important, regardless of your metaphysical framework, just to like exist in this world.
Yeah, no, I love the way that you put that. But the challenge, I think, is that without certain aspects of religion, sometimes it's hard to find a metaphysical framework that would center something like forgiveness and grace.
Agreed.
Because it's so much easier to take a moral grandstand, to point the finger at other people, and social media tends to reward you. The greater your moral grandstanding, the more eloquent your argument in condemnation of the sinner, then you get more likes, you get more views, and it kind of makes you want to do that a little bit more. And it's, if you forgive someone, if you say, I can't really, let's look at a broader view. Maybe it's okay for someone to hold these ideas. Like, you don't get any reward for that, for the nuance or anything like that. Right. So it's one of these things that, it's driving our society somewhere. I don't know where that destination is going to be. But one of the things you mentioned is that there seems to be a common narrative for leaving Mormonism, which is that you reject God, you reject religion, and that's mostly what the dominant narrative is among ex-Mormons. And you kind of look like, you get the sense that people who just like totally throw religion out, anytime anyone comes out and says, well, actually, I found a new spiritual home, it's in Christianity or some other faith-based paradigm, well, those voices tend to get silenced or questioned, and so we don't hear those stories. We don't hear what the meanings are, what the transformation is, and that's one reason that I wanted to have you on, because I thought that your book was such a brilliant exposition of how you take all of the wounds and all of the harm of an upbringing in Mormonism that's marked by the trauma of religious scrupulosity and this demand for purity, and then you take that and the realities that exist outside of Mormonism, trying to make sense of the world, and find an answer in a new faith paradigm, and one that is not just an answer for you personally, but then calls you to act in a pastoral way towards others. What is it about that journey that you see as kind of the greatest aha moments or landmark moments in making that transition that was different from somebody who just abandons religion altogether?
That is, I think about this quite a bit, because to your point, I recognize the ways in which my experience mirrors and then doesn't mirror kind of the let's say the ex-Mormon Reddit narrative, which sometimes I love me some ex-Mormon Reddit because I'm just pissed off and I need to go where other people are. And then sometimes I'm like, okay, this is a lot. But I was talking to a friend about this a few years ago. And I said, and this has sort of stuck with me, I said, my story began in a different place. My transition out of Mormonism began in a different place that I think was really important. And that is, I think a lot of times folks go down a rabbit hole of truth claims, right? So they learn about polyandry, they learn about the Kinderhook plates, they learn about the Book of Abraham being kind of crazy, like all these things, and that sends them into a trajectory of questioning from sort of an empirical standpoint what they've been taught. Whereas my experience later incorporated some of those elements, absolutely, but began with as I described earlier, just a deep sense of existential dread and self-hatred related to a feeling of unworthiness, perpetual unworthiness. And then experiencing an awakening of grace that was very, it was very Jesus-centric. It was very much an experience, it was very much rooted in the person of Jesus. It wasn't just a generic experience of grace. I tell the story in the book, and I've told this a few other places, but what happened was I attended a lecture by a C.S. Lewis scholar who said, I'm a Christian because I know enough of my deficiencies to be devastated. And I don't think I could live if it weren't for the grace of God in Jesus Christ. And when I heard him say that, I had been experiencing deep devastation because of my deficiencies. And I had thought that what you do is you try to work your way out of those, or if you can't, then at the very least you hide them. You don't say in public, can I swear on this podcast or no?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you don't say I'm a fuck up, right? Mm-hmm. You pretend like you're not. You seek to excise it, and here was this man sort of modeling this other way of being that's like, yeah, no, I'm a fuck up, and like here I am, and yet I'm at peace in the midst of that. And there was something about that was so profoundly helpful to me, that was so profoundly moving, and I knew that it had something to do with Jesus. So it started out differently, that it was a spiritual awakening. And then from there, I began to question everything I'd been taught in Mormonism about worthiness, about works, about all of that stuff. And then I stumbled down the rabbit hole, like the weird internet rabbit hole of polyandry and the Kinderhook plates and all of that. But I was already approaching it from a different paradigm, where the way I sort of synthesized that information was like, okay, so Joseph Smith was messed up. But like, so then what that means is Mormons should then just like let go of this idea that we have to be worthy to have revelation or whatever, because obviously Joseph Smith would not have been worthy to have revelation. And the fact that there wasn't room for that, the fact that you couldn't say those things, the fact that those were like sort of forbidden ideas to say, or doubts that you weren't allowed to express, that was more what led me out of Mormonism. It was less the fact of the imperfection in the Mormon story and more just the inability of the framework that had developed to deal with that honestly and to reckon with that honestly. That sort of led me away. And so I think I started in a different place than a lot of ex-Mormon folks do, or folks who are on their way out. And I think that impacted my trajectory in important ways.
Yeah, it's it's enlightening to see that you focus on that moment. One of the things that I thought would be interesting to do was to pull up your book in Kindle and see which chapters, which little quotes meant the most to people, so that they highlighted it the most.
Oh, yeah.
And so if we go up to the Kindle app and pull up your book and then look at popular highlights and sort by most popular, it is that moment where you are speaking that people have. Now, I think looking at the title, it's probably going to be that people who have transitioned out of Mormonism into a Christian faith paradigm are going to be your target audience. And so this moment then is going to be the most important to them. But there was I'm always embarrassed to ask authors to read on their read their own texts.
Yeah.
I don't know how you feel about that, but it's actually if you can maybe start here. Are you able to see it on the screen?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll change the page when you get to the end. If we start and then the final turn.
You got it. And then the final turn. Root shared a personal story, a time when he'd been asked by a colleague how a man as smart as he was could be a Christian. Even 15 years later, I remember his answer as clearly as the moment I heard him speak it. I'm a Christian because I know enough of my deficiencies to be devastated. I don't think I could live without forgiveness and without the love of God. That was it. A simple reply, but I'd never known anyone to admit such a thing out loud. It was the cardinal rule of Mormon spirituality: be ye therefore perfect. And if you couldn't be perfect, you must do all you can to fix it. Try harder. Get absolution from priesthood leaders. Pray more. You didn't name your brokenness. You battled it, sought to excise it with every ounce of energy you possessed. To admit powerlessness in the face of your deficiencies was to let your deficiencies win, to let Satan win. I saw Satan's face in the endowment film, clutching to the tree branch and speaking directly to the camera: if they do not walk up to every covenant they make at these altars in this temple on this day, they shall be in my power. I had been in Satan's power every day of my life. Yet here was a man, mature and accomplished, who knew the devastation of human brokenness but didn't despair over it. He had a lifeline, he said. Forgiveness and the love of God, could it possibly be that simple? He admitted his deficiencies in the present tense. He still had them. He hadn't eradicated them, but somehow he was whole anyway.
All right, I got to save some for people to read it, but there's so much power in there, because like you went straight from his declaration of acknowledging his brokenness, and you just zoned right in to the part that is at the heart of all of our despair, all of our just inadequacy as the Mormonism, and clenched it with some of the imagery and fear that are infused into your knowledge of your own brokenness, specifically Satan in the temple endowment ritual. Because that's one of those things, this concept that you will be in Satan's power is kind of lurking behind all of those messages of your brokenness.
Yes.
And so if that experience of hearing Katie read these things, you get so much more from listening to the audiobook. So I definitely recommend that you check out the Audible version of this book when you can.
Thanks.
In addition to tying the temple ceremony in this, there's one thing that I loved in the book, and it started when you were young, and it was the development of a mantra. Please forgive me of all my sins. Please forgive me of all my sins. And I felt that so deeply. And every time it showed up in every chapter of your life after that, I really felt it. It came up, the first time was you reconciling with having watched Unsolved Mysteries and dealing with, scariness as a young kid. And you did such a beautiful job of just working through the process of discovering that mantra
Mm.
and how of all the different ways that you could pray, something just focused on that. And it's
Mm.
revealing, I think, that repeating that over and over again is the thing that you needed, because it pointed to the part that hurt the most. And then it came up again when you were in a youth conference and talking about the great and noble ones, and you had this private knowledge that you were not one of the great and noble ones. It came up again before a youth temple trip. And I remember those myself when I was, if we're going to the temple, I have to be worthy. And there's going to be a bishop interview. And so it comes up again. It came up again when you're wondering, when you discover the evils of the world and that you may be a monster yourself because these thoughts occasionally pop into your head. This is a normal human experience, but you can't contextualize that. You only see it as pointing to you as a monster, and that mantra comes up. It comes up after a makeout session. It comes up after your own personal endowment and before your wedding. So this thing, it's like a ghost that keeps haunting you.
Mm.
I was reminded of the Haunting of Hill House, where there's the broken neck lady, and she keeps popping up at certain moments. I don't know if you've seen that story.
No, but I love that image. That's amazing.
Can you tell us a little bit about what this mantra meant to you and why it kept appearing so frequently?
I was very much in the, my conception of how you got forgiven had to do with this sort of like, there's all the sins that you do, and then then you have to repent for each one of those sins, right? In order to clean the slate. And I was like constantly terrified I'd missed one. I'd missed a sin. And so I would go back to that. I was like, okay, so this sort of was like the catch-all, this was sort of my attempt at like, so like, forgive me of them all. Forgive me of all my sins. Even the ones that I haven't caught, or even the ones that I don't want to deal with, or whatever. But also, that sort of compulsive praying, that kind of stuff, that's a symptom of religious scrupulosity. That's a symptom of OCD. And I wanted to also portray what that's like from the inside. What is it like to try to seek to find comfort through this kind of repetitive prayer, but you notice it never ever works, right? Because that's the nature of this sort of practice, or even the disorder, is that the more you try to grasp for the certainty, the less you're actually able to feel certain, which is sort of one of the ironies of, I think, of OCD in particular. And so, so I just wanted to portray the way that was just constantly on my mind, and constantly the thing I worried about the most was this sort of like unresolvable sin, that I would miss one somehow.
You mentioned in your Protect LDS Children March that this idea of unworthiness and the need to be worthy and always feeling unworthy haunted you as a Mormon in your upbringing, but even as an adult, it lingers and it surfaces every once in a while. How do you find that popping up in your life now?
I mean, the sort of muscle memory that we have of the way that we've been formed, right? Our spiritual formation, our intellectual formation. Those things don't just go away. And especially if you're dealing with something like a mental illness, like OCD or something like that, it's always gonna be there. The difference that I've found, and this is through this experience of grace, these experiences of grace that I talk about in the book, and then I've been blessed to experience, and then also, like, let's just name it, like therapy. It's really great. And my anti-anxiety medication that I take every day, like, is really helpful. That you learn to, I have learned to not put so much stock into those feelings when they come. So it's like the disturbing thought or the shame or the guilt or the anxiety or whatever will come, and I'll feel it and I'll notice it within myself. But I've learned to have just this much space, like, try to do it like this much space in my mind to be like, okay, this is, oh, there's that again. There it is. And I'm going to have a little bit of space. I'm going to have a little bit of grace for it. There it is. Like, that's part of what it means to be me. That's part of my experience. And yet I don't have to necessarily believe it, right? I don't have to put my trust in it with my whole self, if you will. And I think that having a grace-based worldview really gave me the space, the mental, emotional, and spiritual space to be able to do that. If you're in a worthiness worldview where it's not acceptable to have those flaws because God will leave you, the Spirit of the Lord doesn't inhabit dirty temples, right? Like, your fundamental acceptability is on the line. The risk is not manageable. Whereas if you have a grace-based worldview that says, hey, you're gonna make mistakes, and even if you do, you're forgiven, you're okay, you can be whole. I always say, like, it's not like I had this experience of grace and then I didn't have mental health concerns anymore. It's more that the experience of grace gave me the space I needed to do the work in terms of therapy, mindfulness practice, medication, these other things. It gave me a new paradigm in which to process my experiences, and like freed me up to do some of that kind of hard work.
Yeah, it's been very enlightening to listen to people who are therapists that operate in religious paradigms to talk about how they reconcile the therapeutic mandate to use evidence-based methodology to address mental health concerns, and then the way that you can still allow that to take center space in a religious context by drawing upon those aspects of the religion which can be brought to bear on the challenges that people face.
Right.
And when you take that, Natasha Helfer Parker spoke about this very eloquently in how she helps people, even in a very faithful, somewhat orthodox Mormon background, draw upon the religious tradition of Mormonism to deal with the struggles that we face. But what it brings to mind is that means then that different religions have a different set of tools to bring to bear on dealing with, difficulties.
Yeah.
And I think having the form of grace that you articulate so well in the book, it's kind of like having a different set of tools to deal with those things. So if you're a therapist and that is part of the toolkit that you can use with somebody, it kind of gives you a different sort of power to address these things. What are your thoughts on how the theology shapes the way that someone's able to deal with the difficulties in life in that way?
Yeah. Well, I think, when we talk about theology, that's a really fancy word. And, you go to, I've gone to seminary now and I've read a bunch of people saying fancy things. But at the end of the day, what it is the way in which we construct ultimate meaning, right? That what exactly is life? What exactly is it to be human? What exactly is this world? And those are the kinds of questions that we're dealing with when we talk about theology. And so, yeah, to have a conception of the world that says that at the center of it is this like beating heart of love and grace and forgiveness that desires the reconciliation of all things and all people. That's a really powerful image of ultimate reality that opens up space for healing, opens up space for difference, and opens up space to deal with what is. I think that that's a really important piece as well, that, if we aren't able to acknowledge or name what is real, what is painful, what is broken, what is horrifying, if we can't face that and name it, it's really hard to heal. But having a notion of ultimate reality that it says, yeah, at the end of the day, this is all about reconciliation and wholeness, that provides the space to be able to do that. And particularly, as a Christian, that's what Luther again called a theology of the cross. Whereas the theology of the cross is this idea that he said a theologian of the cross calls a thing what it is, because even God suffered. And so therefore, we suffer, and we can say and name with certainty and clarity, this is suffering that's happening right now and needs to be dealt with.
It strikes me that the messages that I've heard that try to elevate and center grace in a Mormon context, in rare instances, come from the actual apostles. And in your book, you mention a few names of people who've tried to bring this into the Mormon spiritual worldview. Who are some of the people that you see in Mormonism that are trying to bring that idea in and make it, take root?
Yeah. Well, this was 15 years ago now. But I was reading like Millett and Robinson, Stephen Robinson, Robert Millett, and they had books like Believing Christ and Grace Works and some of those things. And I found those really helpful. And then these days there are people like, what's his name? The Letter to the Young Mormon or whatever. Miller, is that?
Oh, Adam Miller.
Adam Miller is one.
Yeah.
I think Dan Witherspoon is one. Like, he's always talking about these sorts of things. I think there are people both in the more sort of Orthodox Mormon lane, and then those maybe a little bit out on the fringes that are having these conversations. But what I always say, and where I always come back to, and I have this argument with my mother a lot, who's a very thoughtful and devout Mormon, I say, Mom, because she also has had some profound experiences of grace, and I'm really grateful for that. But I'm like, Mom, at the end of the day, as long as they're pulling you into a room every 2 years and asking if you have a checklist, asking you this checklist of questions that you have to answer yes in order to get into the highest heaven, as long as that's there, you can say grace all you want, you can use that word. But as long as that structure is in place and there's that gatekeeping, you just don't have a grace-based system. Do I hope and pray that goes away? Yes. I would love for Mormons to completely do away with the temple, which is, not my favorite thing in the world. I don't think they will be taking my advice anytime soon, but call me, church office building, anytime, we can talk. We get hot chocolate, we can talk this through.
I don't know that they're going to let go of that anytime soon. But
no, I think it's too powerful, the control, right? The level of control that they have over people through those interviews, through that checklist, through the holding the salvation hostage. It's too much power, and I don't see them letting go of that in the near future.
Speaking of your family, one important thread that runs through this book is a form of alienation and fragmentation that happens in your family as you and some of your siblings move outside of Mormonism. But then, kind of unexpectedly at the end, there's a reconciliation both with your family as well as a form of reconnection with your genealogy or your heritage. What can you tell us about that journey and how that impacted you?
Yeah, I was just chatting with a friend about this yesterday who read the book, and it was like, it's so funny, how deeply Mormon it is that you had to go back into your ancestors to leave Mormonism. It's like, yeah, that is ironic. That's funny. but that's sort of like the whole framing of this idea of sealed, right? The reason I called the book Sealed was because in addition to holding one's salvation hostage through worthiness, your family is held hostage as well. It's like you don't get to be with your family forever if you don't do the worthiness checklist. And both, I think, just the natural human thing is well, how do I put this? I had a loving family, and so for me, the idea of being separated from them felt like hell. I'm sure that for other people whose families were perhaps not as loving, the idea of being with them forever maybe feels like hell. It's so that, that different people have different experiences. But certainly part of that sort of existential terror that I've talked about had to do with the fear of being separated from my family. And it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? There's this, you're not going to be part of us. Therefore, when you begin to move away, the family unit begins to splinter. This is the pressure that Mormonism, and in particular, I think the temple, puts on people, which is really unfortunate. And so a manifestation of grace for me, one of my experiences was, first of all, to kind of go back into my family line. There's part of me that's like, I'm betraying my family by leaving the church. And I was able to go back into my family line and realize, these people weren't Mormons. I'm not betraying my family by leaving them. And there was sort of a freedom that came from that. And then hopefully I also complicate that notion too as well at the end when I talk about how, that actually we're all sealed by the grace of God to one another. And we don't have to, do elaborate research to know that. But then also within my own family, there was definitely my family of origin, in particular, my parents are both really devout Mormons, and we've had a lot of pain in our relationships in terms of dealing with that. They see myself, and then I have 3 younger sisters who have all left. I have a younger brother who stayed in, but my 3 younger sisters and I have all left. And there's been a lot of pain in our relationships with our parents in particular. And they've had to learn and grow and sort of expand their view of maybe what and who God is, and find some hope, maybe despite themselves, that it's all going to be okay, even though they're connected to a system that would tell them that if they took it like super literally and seriously, that it isn't going to be okay. But they've sort of slowly learned to be able to do that, to find some space for hope, and I'm grateful for that. But it's been a long haul, and lots of conversations and lots of arguments. Lots of dramatic exits from family text chains.
I can relate.
Guilty when I'm dramatically, I'm leaving this text chain. Oh, heaven bless us.
Yeah, that was every moment that I saw your interactions with your father in particular, because you made it so clear that I think there's a moment where you're just like, Dad, I'm not going to live my life trying to live up to your expectations or make you happy. Yeah. And he's like, I didn't know that's what you were doing. You're like, that's all I ever do.
Yeah.
And I think as a father myself, many times you don't understand. You're not in the head of your kids. You don't understand how your actions or just your person, how it affects and drives and motivates them.
Right.
And then that's part of me. That's what's so difficult and dangerous about Mormonism, is it gets its tendrils in those familial relationships.
Yes.
And it provides you a framework for you to other and outside and unclean people who don't hold to the ideology, even though this speaks again to how Mormonism tells you what religion is, and you assume the right world is. And then if you step outside of the Mormon Christian bubble, and then you see how, other other Christian denominations even accept each other's baptisms, and there's this concept of the body of Christ that allows for diversity of thought and diversity of ideas.
Right.
And, you know, this is just by coincidence. I'm not a church goer. I mean, I have a really hard time being a joiner of anything.
Sure.
But I regularly meet in, it's not communion or anything like that, but with a local Lutheran congregation, not in liturgy, not in anything like that, but they have a community outreach center that's, you know, community theater. So we just go and we sing silly songs. And that was kind of my first introduction to a wider view of what religion could be, where
Right.
there's no interviews, there's no demand for purity, there's no test to see if you are thinking the right thoughts. You just come up as you are, and everybody has a context of acceptance and love, and that's just what it is. And so, but at the same time, there's a shared vocabulary that they
Right.
have, a shared set of stories that they can draw meaning and healing from,
Right.
and there's something valuable to that.
Mhm.
And the fact that it survived centuries and eons, I think, is something that can give it at least a form of proof that there's some meaning and drawing that is useful, that has served mankind for some period of time, acknowledging that there's at the same time a way to draw bad, terrible, toxic, manipulative, and dangerous ideas from that. And you wrestle with that a little bit when you talk in your book about your relationship with the Bible.
Mm.
You know what I'm talking about? What are some of the thoughts on that?
Well, I think like one of the pieces of wrestling with with faith and with Mormonism in particular. So Mormonism like is a fundamentalist tradition at its heart, and I don't mean that in the sense of polygamy. I mean that in the more kind of modern, contextual, broader sense of fundamentalism with like extreme literalism and this truth has dropped down from on high and blah 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 blah.
And you can't question it. The dogma is what it is.
Yes, it is what it is, and this is this is the source of all knowledge, kind of a thing. And to your point, I didn't really know that there were non-fundamentalist religions or like traditions that weren't that way. And so in seminary, when I began studying the Bible, it like scared the hell out of me, as I was like, these collections of writings, this collection of writings, has been used in such devastating ways, both in my own life and in the lives of other people that I know and love, and I don't. I'm very afraid of it, and I do not trust it. I very much approached this from a standpoint that I did not trust the Bible as far as I could throw it. And yet they're like, well, you got to learn how to like read this and like preach on it and stuff like that. So I was like, all right, whatever. They're going to make me take these classes. So learning to approach the Bible from a framework, like from a standpoint that could be critical, right? And scholarly in the sense of, okay, like what's the historical reality of where these texts come from? What's the, what is the viewpoint of the different writers who are writing in the Bible, and what does it mean to call the text then holy? Wrestling with those questions really actually opened up a lot of the ways that I could like understand religion kind of writ large. And I came to see that the Bible didn't drop from the sky, fully formed. It wasn't magically translated through a rock and a hat, you know what I mean? Like with the dictated from the mouth of God, but that these were people who were wrestling with difficult questions and were writing things down as they wrestled, and that over time, in a technological framework in which it's not a zero, right? There's no printers, there's not a copy machine. but you have to painstakingly copy things down, like word for word. These manuscripts that continued to be copied down, right? This is before there was even a notion of a sacred canon, anything like that. These texts persevered in the life of this community because they were useful to the community. The community found that there was something about these particular texts that were preserved that helped shape the life and meaning of the community. And this is really different from Mormonism, where, you know, some guy gets up on a Sunday in general conference and all of a sudden his words are scripture. Yeah. That's not how it worked. That's not how the canon evolved, right? The canon evolved through the painstaking, careful selection of the texts over time, as the texts were put into practice in the life of the community over centuries. So there's a certain amount of trust we can have in that. I found that I could have in the texts, in those particular texts, because they had been so preserved and had meant so much to so many people for so long. And so then going into them with a different framework, not like this dropped out of the sky as a dictate from God, but like, what is it about this that was worthy of preservation, that gave life and meaning to this community for so long? You know, why, you know, what the book of Job, why? You know, what is it about the book of Job? This thing that wrestles with, you know, pain and devastation. You know, why these particular versions of the Jesus story? Why were these the ones that persevered instead of the other ones that, you know, that had been around? And beginning to ask that question was a totally different question from, did it quote unquote happen exactly the way that it's like written here? Or, you know, is it infallible? Or, you know, those are not the questions that I ask about the Bible, and those aren't really the questions I ask about my faith. It's more about like, what meaning is made from this? What meaning has been made from this throughout the centuries? And what might this text that has been so reliable for so long be calling us into today? And that's just a really different way of looking at scripture. It's a really different way of looking at religious authority, right, than some of the ways that we were taught to do so as Mormons. And it opens up a whole new world of questions and engagement.
I think the picture that was painted about what scripture is, what church is, what religious authority is, it's kind of this calcified shell that you have as a Mormon that you have to chip away and realize that that's not exactly how other religious paradigms contextualize these things, because you just assume that. I remember even for myself, there was, you know, we had started to look at the world outside of Mormonism. We went and attended this local Lutheran church, and it was a sermon on the book of Job. But it started out with saying, this is a mythology. This never happened. It's a moral play that was included in scripture. So you don't have to take it literally, but these are the meanings that we can draw from it and give us a sense of how to deal with this great question that it was addressing, which is, how do we deal with tragedy that happens in the, you know, to good people and to bad people, and how can we continue to have hope in the face of that tragedy? And it's something that has a utility for individuals and for society, as individuals in that society wrestle with these things. And just reconceiving scripture as that totally broadens and opens up how you can use it and what it means in your life. And no longer is it where it's kind of like you have to take something that you find in scripture that actually is a outdated and wrong and hurtful and harmful moral message and be able to discard it. You don't have to like try to code it with some goodness and make it good. You can just say, okay, and this is now the part of the story where we learn what not to do, or something like that.
Well, and the other thing to keep in mind is that scripture argues with itself, right? Like there's this idea that emerges in like the 19th and 20th centuries, that there's like some grand unifying, you know, story of the scripture, and there are definite themes, and there are some definite kind of things that come up again and again. but like it's constantly arguing with itself. The book of Job is arguing against the Proverbs, which have a much more sort of straightforward, perspective, or what we call the the people that wrote Deuteronomy. Like there's a tradition very much of be righteous and God will bless you, that's present in those texts. And the book of Job is like, actually no. Or like the book of Ruth is arguing against some of the more nationalistic strains of Ezra Nehemiah, where it's like, in Ezra Nehemiah, it's like, divorce all the foreign women. And in the book of Ruth, it's like, marry the foreign women, and out of those unions will come David, the king of, the greatest king of Israel. So the texts are arguing with themselves. And recognizing that provides a lot of freedom to then enter into that argument and enter into that conversation about, like, where do I stand? Where do I fall? Am I more like James or am I more like Paul? And it's okay to like recognize the diversity of theological perspectives within the text itself, or the texts, I should say. It's not a monolithic thing. It's a bunch of different texts that we've put together in a collection of books. So
it also frees you up to find those types of meaning in books outside of Scripture.
Right.
I think a lot of people say that some of that long-term stability of the Scripture serves as an anchor point that you can then judge other things that come in here. But when it's arguing with itself, and I think atheists frequently will, there's like these huge long lists of internal contradictions. And they would say, oh, you're saying that it argues with itself. I just say it's internally contradictory, and so you can just throw it out with the trash. How do you deal with that impulse where you could say, well, in a particular part, God is commanding genocide and commanding his people to take sexual slaves? Like, if that's in the book, why do I have to pay attention to this book at all? I mean, why is it even there? Because now I have to navigate these wrong parts that are attributed to God. Why not just get my moral grounding from The Lord of the Rings or the writings of C.S. Lewis or something like that?
So, I mean, those are great questions. There's a couple of things that come to mind, and first of all, it's to historically ground the premise of that question. So the premise of that question is rooted in sort of a backlash to fundamentalism. And fundamentalism is itself a historical phenomenon, historical movement that arises out of the Enlightenment, and particularly the advancement of sort of scientific knowledge. And what the fundamentalists do is the question at the heart of sort of the empirical movement is, okay, we have to ground our knowing in observable phenomena. And the fundamentalists say, no, we have to ground our knowing in this text, right? And so then this clash of conversations comes between the people that want to ground their knowing in observable phenomena and the people that want to ground their knowing in these texts. And so then they think it's a gotcha that there's like contradictions in the text, or they think it's a gotcha that there's internal inconsistencies or whatever. But that's arguing from a premise that says that the text must be infallible, which is a premise that I reject, right? And so then the question becomes, how do we make meaning? This is really a question of how human beings make meaning. Because the one thing that the sort of verifiable kind of scientific kind of worldview doesn't do super well is the why. It does do like the how. It does do to a large extent. I mean, obviously, the scientific process means that we're always evolving in terms of what our knowledge is, our understanding of the world is. But it doesn't do great with helping us understand why, or helping us put together a framework that kind of can guide and guard our morality and our sense of ethics and our sense of social obligation. And so it's funny that you pointed to like Lord of the Rings or C.S. Lewis, for example, because those are both writers who are deeply embedded within a Christian ethic, within a Christian worldview. And so this desire for both the empiricists and the fundamentalists to sort of pretend like they're decontextualized from history is kind of funny to me. It's a little bit ironic. So everything is contextualized. Everything is historical. There's no like clean, pristine, right? Knowledge, except maybe perhaps the mystery of God in God's self. And so, yeah, just it's okay then to approach the text with a critical eye. It's okay to approach the text and understand its historical groundedness. It's okay to wrestle with the ethics and implications of that, just as we would any claims of morality or meaning, and not need it to be perfectly pristine. Does that answer that question? It's kind of like philosophical, but
well, I think it has to be, because you're wrestling with a book that's written for a time and a place in a cultural context and in a religious understanding that then gets carried through the centuries. And now you've got people with a completely different worldview looking back on those things, and it's speaking to a different people. It's meaning a different thing, and our understanding of the way to ethically and morally interact with each other as individuals, interact with each other as nations. All of those things evolve and change. And the idea that what we're doing is drawing meaning from them without being dictated how we should think by them. I'm reminded there's like a, the Naked Pastor does these comics that are great to look at.
Yeah, they're good.
One of them is, some people looking into scripture and saying, well, this scripture says you have to do this, this, and this, or we condemn you for this, and so we're interpreting the scripture with this in mind. And the response is, well, you start with love, and then you interpret scripture and challenge it against the standard of love. And that is how you can interpret and act on scripture. And it's just a different paradigm for, using scripture in the context of religion, as well as, dealing with your own experiences as a human. There's some postmodernism I'm hearing in the way that you're approaching this. And it reminds me of your bio, which brings up an interesting bit of phraseology that I haven't heard before, and I was wondering if you could explain it a little bit. Let's see if I can find it. So if you want to know more about Katie and the work that she's done, then she has a website that you can go to, which is katielangston.org. Is that right?
.com.
Oh, katielangston.com. And if you go to the About page, let's see here. Okay, one of the things that it says, I guess it's on your author bio on Amazon, actually, sealed Katie Langston. Because it said something about dealing with the gospel of Christianity in a postmodern, post-Christian world. What do you mean by that? That's kind of an unusual way to phrase these things.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is like, I wouldn't claim to be a postmodernist. I flirted with postmodernism for a while, but ultimately ended up feeling it was a lot bit kind of nihilistic. And so, but I think that a lot of the postmodern critiques of, say, modernism are valid as well, like this sort of, that's sort of what I'm getting at with this question of, the science can do a lot for us, and I embrace, science and technology, and I, do not need to be committed to a 6,000-year-old Earth or anything like that, right? Like I can recognize truth, scientific truth or whatever. But it has created something of a crisis of meaning, I think, which postmodernism is responding to through like the deconstruction of these, these notions of complete, like as if human beings can access objective truth perfectly. And I think that that's a valid critique. I think that there's a certain amount of humility that we need to have as we look at the world and recognize that there's more to the world, life, the universe, and everything that we can necessarily see with our five senses, or that we even have the capacity to understand, at least presently. So I'm both sympathetic to some of the critiques that postmodernism has of modernity. At the other hand, I'm like really scared about now the total turn to like everything is narrative and we can make up whatever facts we want, or like some of the kind of, I think some of the divisions, the identity politics of our time have really arisen because of the kind of postmodern project, where now it's like, on the one hand, you've got the empiricists saying, there's objective truth and we can know it. And then there's the postmodernists saying there's no such thing as objective truth and it's all narrative and it's all made up. It's all language from top to bottom. And I'm like, your critiques of each other are valid. And I'm more in the minds of there is objective truth, but we can't fully know it. It's sort of where I land on those things. So there is something that's real. There's a reality that really exists. External to ourselves, and yet as human beings we're not capable of like fully grasping that. So the question about, go ahead.
No, I mean, it brings to mind then, like, how do you, knowing that movement is out there and we're seeing it start to shape our society in increasing ways, and we're seeing what you predict is that there's greater divisiveness, as we retreat to a form of looking at the world through identities, it creates greater divides. Because there's, that comes in and we start seeing each other as factions rather than a universal humanity. Right. And this is where a lot of people are raising alarm bells that taking, anytime you get involved in any ideology, you can look at the good things and the positive things. And I agree with a lot of the things that you've mentioned here, but look at the extremes. Look at the fundamentalists. Look what happens when you take it too far, and then find some way to draw a line. And where you draw the line tells you what principles you hold within you to be, something you can rely on. And so that is where I think people are starting to see that project taken to its extremes is incompatible with a Christian worldview that looks at all humans as God's children, and that is the single identity that then unifies and brings people together, versus something that tries to bring individual separating identity markers to the forefront and have that dominate how you interact with each other and drive how you interact with each other. So that's it. It's interesting to hear you say that, because when you describe yourself as, dealing with the gospel in a postmodern world, it sounds like it's not that you're trying to bring postmodernity into and magnify it in the gospel, which can be very challenging, but rather respond to some of the impulses perhaps that postmodernity has brought into our society that, when taken too far, work against what the gospel stands for.
Yeah, and a lot of what concerns me about what we see right now is that things are framed entirely in the sense, in a framework of a will to power.
Yes.
Right? So it's like in a context of competing narratives, where fundamental truth is doesn't exist, and it's about whose narrative can win. Then we can squash and dehumanize and reject the other, right? And it's about our side triumphing powerfully over their side. Now, this is where I think, so this is where I'll make a positive case then for Christianity, right? And this is where I think the fundamental notion of Christianity, the fundamental claim of Christianity is that ultimate power is most profoundly expressed in a God who enters human experience as a vulnerable baby and dies upon a Roman political implement of torture, such that ultimate power, what is real power, what is actual power, what God is telling us in this, is that real power is self-sacrifice, real power is grace, real power is forgiveness, that is not wrought through coercion, right? But through love. And I think that that's really important for this political moment where we are seeking to literally existentially destroy the other, the political opponents, right? To overpower them, to quote unquote cancel them, which happens on the right and the left. They both do this. And I don't want to like both sides too much. I think that the impulses of authoritarianism are more prominent on the right now than they are on the left, but the authoritarian impulses definitely exist in both places. And what the gospel says is that that's not how it gets done. That Jesus comes as the king, right? The king, the emperor, meant to restore the throne of Israel, right? It's a political claim that's being made here. But that the kingdom that God brings is one of peace and of justice and of non-coercion. We have to really wrestle with what that means in this context, in this moment. Because I think we're in an authoritarian moment right now. And it's not in the book, but that's what this is what I think about it. And that there is something profoundly important about a different model of power, one that centers self-giving, mercy, forgiveness, right? Jesus hung out with the Republicans and the Democrats of his day. Sometimes I see people on both sides, like I see my more, let's say progressive Christian friends saying, Jesus, would have been wearing Birkenstocks and blah, blah, blah. I was like, I don't know. Jesus dined with the tax collectors, which is like which would be the, who would the tax collectors would be the, the neocons of the day, right? That would be Liz Cheney. That would be, right?
I thought they booted her out. I don't know.
But then the people on the right are like, well, Jesus, I'm going to bring this cross down to the Capitol as I attempt to like overthrow the government. It's like, well, no, Jesus actually died upon the cross rather than take up arms. So you think about that.
The thing that that brings to my mind is your idea of reconceptualizing the notion of power, because all of those things that you point to in terms of what the Book of Mormon would say is the condescension of God,
Mm-hmm.
How it affects your life
Mm-hmm.
in taking on the Christian mantle and seeing that the imperative of love drives your actions, the power that gives you, combining with grace and forgiveness, is a power to connect with and exist alongside people who are different from you.
Exactly.
And that's the thing that when you talk about our lack of meaning, there's a lack of beauty, there's a lack of appreciation, a lack of gratitude, all these different things, as I've encountered people who have really internalized the postmodern project, taken upon, deconstruction and problematizing become the ritual. And you take anything that is good or beautiful or anything that has gained dominance because people like it or whatever, and you look for the problems, and your ability to articulate those problems and tear it down and make it a nothing elevate you. But what you're missing then is the beauty that goes along with it. And so, like, I'm a big theater fan. I love Gilbert and Sullivan. And there's a play that they have called The Mikado. And it was created at a moment in time in England where they had just discovered Japan and imported and colonized a bunch of Japanese art and ceramics, and it was a big buzz. So they used some of that context to create a play that made fun of British society and British government, using that as a context. So it seemed foreign. You could do more by making fun of something that wasn't at home.
Right.
And so now so it's now part of kind of English culture, this play, but it draws on what they saw as Oriental at the time, but specifically Japanese culture. Well, now whenever any production tries to do that play, they can't. And there's been productions where they go into rehearsal, they do everything all the way up, but then somebody says, well, this is culturally insensitive, it's racist, and you can't play it anymore. And so there's a discussion to be had about, whether something like that could be made today, and the type of sensitivities that we have, and what type of thought could go into it. And you can agree with the accusation that it's racist and just blank it out. Just say it should now be burned. We should burn this book like we burn any other book, because it's not perfect. It doesn't have every perfect ideal. But when you do that, even though there are problematic parts of it, you're missing out on the beauty. Now, this is one where there's a very visible, very palpable example of what's problematic with it. But I've seen people who had a love of theater and a love of movies adopt this ideology and become, they would say they become more committed and more understanding of the principles of their ideology. From outside, you say, well, you've kind of become more radicalized. You're finding problems where they don't exist. You're reading intent where it doesn't exist. And then you're taking your interpretation of things as problematic as how you should depict the entire thing. And suddenly you can't enjoy any plays, you can't enjoy any musicals, you can't enjoy any books, because you're just finding the problems with it and then allowing what you perceive as the worst part of it, according to a certain ideology, paint the whole thing. And so we're missing out on a great deal of beauty. Now, that's a book or literature. Imagine doing that to a loved one.
Right.
None of our family and friends are perfect.
Right.
And we can all find things in the past of the people around us that we can then use to condemn them and say, I'm not going to allow you back into the space of my life, my existence, unless you conform yourself, unless you humiliate yourself. And then but then it's a constant checking to make sure that you're conforming to the ideology. And that's part of when I see that our society outside of the religious realm is moving in that direction, I find much more peace being among people who have the rooting and grounding of this principle of grace and forgiveness, that are able to appreciate, even the thing that they love that means the most to them, their religion, their scripture, whatever. It has deplorable histories, deplorable parts, but they find meaning in it. And that to me is the sentiment that I'm capturing, I guess, that I'm wrestling with myself, and how to make sense of this, because I'm not a joiner. I have such, I don't know if it's a trigger, just like even I've gone to some Lutheran liturgies, and just as soon as everyone starts talking together, I'm like, oh, it's the temple. I'm just like, I can't deal with it. I don't know. Have you picked up on any of this, or how do you deal with these things?
I mean, I think you raised some really, salient questions about where we are right now. On the one hand, I do think the deconstructive task, or the acknowledgement of the ways that things are problematic and have been problematic is a good one. I think when we look at the Bible or whatever, there's a hermeneutic called the hermeneutic of suspicion. Hermeneutic means the lens through which you view the text. So you
kind of like the analytical tool that you bring.
The analytical tool that you're using, that you're applying. So I think it's there are times when it makes sense to pull out the hermeneutic of suspicion, right? When you're looking at, did God really command the genocide of these people, right? Let's pull out the hermeneutic of suspicion for that one. If there are problematic pieces of art or whatever, things from the past that maybe we didn't examine how those pieces of art might have perpetuated harmful stereotypes or created a culture of othering people based on
cultural superiority
or whatever. Like, yeah, let's pull out the hermeneutic of suspicion for that. Let's question that. But ultimately, where I think in practice the postmodern project falls down, sort of like what you're talking about, is then once it's deconstructed, what do you do with it? You've got this like rubble of deconstructed things. And so how do we then reconstruct? And what does it mean to reconstruct in a healthy and a positive way? And on what do we ground that reconstruction? And that's sort of the question is once you've deconstructed everything, then again, it's just like whose narrative wins versus saying, hey, there's actually something real here. And the thing that's real, the thing that's like real at the bottom of it is grace and mercy, forgiveness and justice and peace, that's what's real. And I don't mind staking that claim. I will make that claim that like that is what is true. And I'm willing to say that, right? That is what is true. And I'm willing to say that is what is true because that's what was revealed in Jesus Christ. That's what was revealed in the coming of God in Christ. That at the bottom of everything, at the heart of reality, is this beating core of love and mercy, self-giving, and justice. And I think that's something that is worth staking a claim on, even if I'm wrong. I'm willing to stake my life on that. I don't know. I've never died. What's after we live? I don't know. I've never been there. Yet I'm willing to live from that. I'm willing to live from that place with, for lack of a better word, faith, trusting that that's true, that that's really what is at the center of things.
It mirrors, I think, kind of what footing I've been able to have on this realm is, there's a lot of people, and you'll hear this frequently in religious circles, that say Christ died and rose from the dead. And it's that hope that you have in rising from the dead that drives a lot of the people who are hopeful for Christ, because we have this existential dread as humans who are finite, who live for a period of time, and we have a fear of death, a fear of the unknown in that regard. And I find that motivation to me is fraught with peril, because it is based on fear and it's things that are unknowable. And so it doesn't drive me. It's not the thing I want to base how I operate my life on, but the principle of love and empathy, and trying to extend to other people the same grace that I want to have extended for me. Those are things that do have meaning for me. And they are things that I can also find and draw from in the spiritual, and the story, the meaning that is conveyed by a Christian imperative to love. And so I find myself very much at home among people who frame their lives around that. And that's why, even though I'm not a joiner, I tend to gravitate toward that. And that may just be a reflection of my upbringing in a Christian Mormon context. But one of the things that is a stumbling block for me is trust. And one of the things that I kept coming back to my mind in this book is, once you've been betrayed so wholly, because even though it was that spiritual lever that you turned on, and then you went down the factual realm. When I went down the factual realm, I learned that I had been betrayed and harmed and manipulated so deeply that my ability to trust any other organized religion, any other people telling me what God wants for me, is just gone. And I start to react viscerally when I see and encounter that. So did you wrestle with trust? How did you find trust in a new spiritual world after Mormonism? Because it's really hard.
Oh, it's really hard. And yeah, I absolutely wrestled with trust. I talk about this in the book, but even after my experience, of grace and sort of having my paradigm shifted, I could not pray for years. Could not pray. I didn't want to pray. I didn't trust, myself to pray, to like hear what was being said, or to interpret it correctly, or I didn't trust. I was afraid that that I would learn that I'd gotten it wrong, right? That God wasn't actually loving and good and full of grace. And so I was like, I've worked this out. It's like pretty good. I'm just gonna like leave it here for a while and not mess with it. And I think that that's a really natural and probably even a healthy response once, when you leave a tradition like Mormonism that did so much harm. It does so much harm to so many people. And, why would you jump right back into something, without checking it out, like really thoroughly? Yeah. One thing that comforts me, and this has been my experience, and again, so this is Lutheran of me, but I always say I don't believe these things because Luther said them. I kind of like just experientially stumbled into them and then found out that Luther had described them well. That's how I feel about it. But one of the things that he talks about is how faith itself is a gift. We don't will ourselves to faith. There's no way to force ourselves to believe. That's just not how it happens. It's just not a real thing. And so we don't have to like try to twist ourselves in knots. My belief, again, this is what I hope is true anyway, is that we have a God who is so loving and who so much wants to be in relationship with us that this God will pursue us. And what I found in being pursued by God is that there are times when I needed God to stay away for a while. And God was happy to do that as well. And so I think if you're in a place where you feel like you can't trust, that's okay. Let that be there. You don't have to. What I counsel folks to do sometimes, depending on where they're at, is just to pay attention to if and when and how that might begin to shift or change. There might come a time when you begin to feel a tug toward, boy, I really wish I were in community. A spiritual community of some kind. Or there might come a time when you begin to feel a tug, looking at the sunset or on a hike, that you're just like drawn into like awe of the world around you, and you feel, despite your own lack of belief in anything or sense of anything, that you just want to say thank you to whatever is out there, right? And just pay attention to if and when those things come up. And take one step at a time as those impulses, as those desires are stirred within you, and see what happens. But I'm not of the mindset that, this is something this trusting is something I really need to work on that or whatever. My sense is that God is working on it. You don't have to.
Well, that's I think just me not being a joiner is an expression of my inability to trust. Mm-hmm. And I have felt, and I understand, the pull of community. Because Mormonism is so encompassing in your life. Mm-hmm. You're there on Sunday, you're there on Saturday, sometimes you're there on Wednesday. In your teenage years, you're there every morning. Mm-hmm. If you're in Texas anyway. I know it's different in Utah during the day. And, it's such a big part of your life. And I think particularly for me as a young person, even though, I struggled with all the guilt of the factory maintenance and all the shame and all the worthiness and everything. Yeah. At the same time, I loved meeting up with my friends and, having root beer floats or, hey, we're all going to go to Wet and Wild together. And just like all of that was such a vibrant and wonderful part. Even like the dances, like I'd go and I would be on the corner and it would just be me and my friend, and we'd talk about the girls that we had crushes on, but we would never go and dance. And when I did dance, it was terrible. And I definitely should not have danced. But, it was just like, it was my coming of age, and it was crazy. It was stupid, but it was mine.
Yeah.
And my kids don't have that.
Yeah.
And I know every journey, every story, every individual is going to be different. It's going to be shaped by the circumstances of their time. But there's this framework that's there. And I'm really scared to bring them into any other tradition's framework, but just because I don't know what kind of traumas are there that I don't know about. My own mom didn't know about the grilling about masturbation that happens in the interview. She's like, why are they asking you that? I didn't know they were asking you that kind of stuff. I don't have a problem with it. But it's like, no, this like made me hate myself for years.
Right.
And I don't know, it's tough because there is this need for community. And not only that, there's a function when you're in a group of people with shared values and you're trying to figure out what it means to be an adult, as a young adult, a youth on the cusp of adulthood, and having milestones that people around you are achieving that you can kind of gauge yourself by, that have been mapped out so you have a way to do that. Those are all, they serve a purpose that stabilizes, that binds a community together, that gives a community strength. And when you lose Mormonism, you lose that. And trying to rebuild or recover that, there's not many things that hold that together as well. I'm a big fan of Yu-Gi-Oh! And no matter what community you go in, it's a card game. It's a children's card game that my kids got me hooked on, that I named my puppy dog after. And you, much like any church, you can go to like any community in the world, and like almost every night there's like a group of nerds that get together and play this card game, and there's a community there, but they're not as full and robust as a religious community. There's not an ethic of taking showers, so sometimes it's difficult to be in that room. But, there's different communities that you can find, but churches and religion evolving over time have served such a full thing that there's this way of understanding religion outside of that fundamentalist paradigm as just an aspect of how communities come together under shared values. And when you let go of that fundamentalist view of it, and you realize that a lot of these churches that are out there don't have that, you can come to them with an understanding of what those red flags are, of all of the undue influence, all of the dangerous aspects of religion, and perhaps share and partake in the benefit of the good parts of it. For me, I have to keep myself at a really long arm's length. So community theater, I'm there.
Perfect.
Hard time giving away the second Saturday, but they accept me there and they love me there. And there's this, when I say they love me there, what I mean is I feel loved when I'm there. And there's a story that I heard them tell of, I guess in the youth Lutheran tradition, there's a period of time where they say they are going to go through some sort of, I don't know if it's catechism or where they're learning in a specific way the lessons. And at the end, they invite the graduates of this program to stand up, and it's sort of like giving your testimony, just a statement of your belief or a statement of where you are. And one of the kids that had gone through this got up and said, you know what, I don't know what I believe. I don't know if God is real. I don't know if this whole thing is completely made up. But what I do know is that I feel like I'm among my family here, and I feel the love that comes from that. And if that is okay, then I feel at home. And it was okay. And that's very different from, like, can you stand up in Mormonism, in Relief Society, in Elders Quorum and say, I don't believe Joseph Smith, I don't believe Jesus, I don't believe any of those things, but I really like funeral potatoes, and I really like, I like kind of hanging out with you guys and that quirky Studio C sense of humor that y'all have. Y'all are like the whitest kids in the room, but I like it here. And is that okay? And I think Mormonism has moved to accept a broader range of perspectives on Mormonism. There's always that thing where when you say that, you become a project. You become, now the missionaries are going to work on you because we've got to change and evolve you. You're not good enough with that statement. We've got to move you to that. And it's very different from just saying, you're good where you are. We're glad to have you. And it doesn't really even matter. Maybe your views will change, maybe they won't, but that doesn't matter because you're in our community. We love you. We accept you. And that's something that I see outside of Mormonism that was not part of my Mormon experience. And it changed my perspective on what religion was, because if all of religion was what Mormonism was, I wouldn't want anything to do with it.
Right. I'm glad you've had that experience. And, I mean, I don't want to like paint an overly rosy picture. There are high demand, undue influence groups that are out there. And so I think what you say about like knowing what those red flags are is really wise. And then engaging cautiously, like any community that like when you're just dipping a toe in is like trying to like get you to take the full plunge immediately, like stay away from those folks.
Yeah. Yeah, the rapid commitment model
Yeah.
is a red flag.
Oh, goodbye. Like, no, no, there shouldn't be any healthy.
One of those red flags is really hard. That's the love bombing, because,
right?
I showed up and I was like the ex-Mormon who sang Gilbert and Sullivan. And so they like really welcomed me. And it was just, it felt really good. But like, there's like, okay, when's the pitch? When is it going to be like I have to come and do some weird thing, or I have to come to some meeting or something? And it's like it never came.
Yeah.
They do some prayers before some of the performances, but they're like, one of them gave a pirate prayer, which I guess there's like an old pirate prayer that
really
is probably sacrilegious. If you just Google pirate prayer, there's something like that. But it was just like an example of a mode of, this is when we did Pirates of Penzance.
Yeah.
And but it just and they cuss, there's like inappropriate jokes and humor from the leaders.
Yeah.
But that's because their spiritual paradigm isn't one of, we have to put out this image of perfection, of purity that is a signature of what you are. The having grace as the center of your cultural spiritual landscape is very different from having purity and worthiness at the center. It shapes the culture. And that was my experience in it. So that's why I'm very happy to have you here to talk a little bit about things.
That's awesome.
We are at an hour and 47 minutes. Now, we do have the ability to take calls from viewers. Are you open to that?
Yeah. I've been watching the chat a little bit. There's been such a good, robust conversation in there. That's awesome.
Okay, so if you would like to pose a question or share a bit of your insight or experience with author Katie Langston, then you can call 210-422-2222 and share your thoughts with us. In the meantime, let's see if there are any comments worth discussing. Of course, Katie is a gem of a person. Thanks for having her on. I continue to echo that. If you're familiar with the channel, we've had Katie on before to talk about worthiness interviews, and she brought a great deal to the conversation. Derek Knox, who's co-host of his own podcast, that the name escapes me right now, asked the question, can the two of you speak to Jennifer Roach's approach to one-on-one interviews? Okay. And I would say that both of us have spoken to Jennifer Roach's approach to one-on-one interviews. There's an episode on Talk on Things and Stuff that is specifically takes her talk and does a bit-by-bit commentary on it. How would you summarize that, Katie?
That she misses the distinction between a voluntary youth-initiated conversation with a trusted leader and an involuntary leader-initiated conversation with the youth to go over a checklist of worthiness requirements. So she's not wrong that it's great for youth to have trusted pastoral leaders that they can talk to. That is not what a worthiness interview is. And so she conflates those things.
All right, we've got our first call.
Yay.
Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Katie, can you hear the
I can hear, yes.
Excellent. What's on your mind?
So kind of to backtrack towards the beginning where she was talking about grace, things like that. Forgiveness and healing and reconciliation, things like that. in the context of religion, especially Christianity, is you have the possibility of healing at some future date, that all things will be made right at some point, or that all things will be restored to you at some point. And yet in the world that we live in, we know that that's not always the case, and we can't necessarily rely on the meta-narrative of Christianity to, promise us that in some heretofore future date, afterlife, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so without that, we know that some things can't be healed and some things can't be made right, and people can't be brought back from the dead. And so a Christianity that is honestly, frankly, devoid of miracles, that Lazarus doesn't come back from the dead, Jesus doesn't rise on the third day, people don't, lepers aren't healed. I don't know that Christianity can provide the justification for forgiveness and reconciliation and grace unless those things are present. And I don't think that there's a secular alternative to that can be made either.
So what's your solution?
Well, that's kind of, I don't have a solution. I've been trying very hard to think of one, or to try to find a way around that. Cause I do think that there are value to those things, but I don't know that it's viable to expect those of people or to kind of promote that as a worldview unless you can provide that justification for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's, a couple of things come to mind. And again, these are big questions, and I would never pretend to say, here's the answer, because that's just not reality. A couple of things come to mind. One is one of the things that we talk about in terms of faith, in terms of Christian faith, is that we live in a time of now and not yet. So we live in a time where, that I think it's actually, I think it's a lazy and almost useless strain of Christianity that pushes everything out to the next life, right? Everything's going to be okay tomorrow, and so that relieves us of the duty or obligation to care for the present. So I really affirm that critique that I hear in what you're saying, because I think that's right. I think that a next life focused Christianity is not a useful one. At the same time, to hold out hope that eventually all things can be made right, or will be made right, is it's an article of faith, right? It's not something for which there's objective, demonstrable proof for that, but it's the impulse to live into that now comes from the hope that that's how it will be in the future. And so it's my experience of it. I root the way that I live with love, and hopefully with love and justice and grace in the present, because of the hope that eventually, in ways that I can't see or understand, that eventually that the world will be healed in that way. That's sort of what we call the eschatological. That's a big seminary word for the ultimate end of all things, that we have hope, and a hope that the end of all things is for good. And so that's one thing I say. It's you're right. Part of the spiritual journey of the Christian journey is the acknowledgement of that tension, the living in the here, the now and the not yet, that we're hoping for the kingdom to fully come, right? The peaceable kingdom of peace, or whatever. The other thing, I might push back a little bit on what you said about how, not all things can be healed, and Christianity says that it can be. I mean, it always strikes me, and I recently preached on the Doubting Thomas text, so it's been on my mind lately. But in that text, the disciples are huddled in a room and they're really afraid, and Jesus Jesus shows up in the middle, and Thomas, because Thomas has said he won't believe unless he sees the wounds of Jesus' body for himself. And it always strikes me how Thomas doesn't recognize him until he puts his hand in the wounds of God. God retains the wounds of this pain in his very body, is what that story is saying. And so I think that the kind of hope that we have for the future, if we do have one, isn't one where like those bad things never happened and they never left scars. It's not like everything gets wiped clean and we don't have to reckon with the devastation and the agony of living. That there is a part of what grace means is to fully acknowledge that terror and to fully acknowledge that harm. And the Christian story, the hope of the resurrection, which I do believe happened, even though I don't know what that means or looks like exactly, right? I don't think it's like as straightforward as like,
right.
That there's something cosmically changed about Jesus' resurrected body that defies description and understanding. But that what that says is that this world leaves its mark. And so the hope that we have for the future is one that isn't devoid of the reality of the pain and suffering of this world. What do you think?
I don't have any way to necessarily like argue with that or push back on that, but that is something to think about, I suppose.
Katie, the thing that popped into my mind when he was first describing it is, I think something that religions have to wrestle with in the first place, and that is the way that their teachings, their theology can lead to being used to spiritually bypass or to use the religion to ignore problems, ignore suffering. Even if you can't make everything whole and right, there are moments where theological or religious ideas can be used to make it so that you don't actually do the work that you would otherwise feel compelled to do. And I'll give an example of this. So there's this, I frequent discussion forums about survivors of marital infidelity. And there's this thing called the Jesus cheater. And what the Jesus cheater does is that they've been a serial adulterer, and then they have a religious awakening, and Jesus has forgiven them. They've been baptized. Their sins have been washed clean. And so you can't bring up their past infidelity because Jesus has forgiven them. Why can't you? Aren't you trying to be like? And so that concept of spiritual bypassing, where you're using religion as a framework to ignore real issues in the world and to bypass having to deal with them. And in Mormonism, it could be the earth is going to be renewed and receive its paradisiacal glory, so why do we really have to be worried about the environment?
Right.
Or anything like that. And so there are things that are real issues that have consequences that cannot be resolved if you don't do anything about it.
Yeah.
But the religion can serve as a way to ignore it. And to the extent that it does that, it can be harmful, and you've got to work past that.
Yeah.
So that's the thing that kind of popped into my mind listening to his initial concern.
Yeah.
Well, I know that for me, I actually, as it were, come at it from the other side of that equation. So not necessarily the Jesus cheater who, decides to, just cheat willy-nilly, but the person who does wrong, and maybe he's even done a grievous wrong, and there really just isn't a way for them to undo that. And so the possibility of reconciliation and the possibility of forgiveness, especially in this life, is just gone.
Well,
And
I mean, I can
so,
speak to that.
I mean, there's
I've
well, go ahead. What were you going to say, John?
no, I mean, I can speak to that to some extent in that I went through a traumatic experience in my life around this issue.
Mm-hmm.
And in that moment, there was a production of Godspeed, I think it was, and that they were doing. I wasn't participated in it, but I attended it. And there's a question at the center of it with what to do about the apostle that betrays Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And that question was important to me because I felt like I had been betrayed in a way that I tried to reconcile that ultimately did not work.
Mm-hmm.
And so the concept of forgiveness, I was like, how do I even,
Mm-hmm.
where does forgiveness, because you can, like, forgiveness doesn't fix anything that was broken. And so for me, a lot of it was, forgiveness can be weaponized also.
Yes.
You see this in child abuse
Yes,
where
can.
they tell the victim, you have to forgive
Yeah,
your abuser.
Right.
And so then the victim themselves feels like, well, now there's this expectation that they have where they don't know how to do it. If it's a kid, they have no idea how to conceptualize that. And if
Right.
you're an adult, there's so many more issues at it. So what I came away from that is forgiveness is not for me to really, like, I don't even know how to relate to that. What I can relate to is I can forgive myself for those times where I tolerated and allowed things which I should not have done, where I didn't understand where boundaries should have been drawn, where I didn't understand where I shouldn't be blaming myself. You know, I can forgive myself for that, and I can take the feelings of anger and hatred and revenge that, you know, occasionally pop into your mind, and you just kind of put those, eventually those things subside. They're a natural part of the process of grief. But as you don't act on them, as you just try to focus on those things that are important and central for the people that are depending on you, then they will subside in time. And you can remember that the relationships that you have with someone who may have wronged you are different from the relationships that they have with other people around them. But just like what I see people express as the concept of grace and forgiveness, acknowledging your own weakness, your own brokenness in that paradigm, and a way to overcome it, practicing and getting in the habit of extending that to other people in the face of things that they have done for you that can't be made right. There's a little bit of the miracle of it all in that, in being able to forgive somebody who is not, you know, that other people would find unworthy of forgiveness or unable to forgive. And it frees me up. I don't have to occupy the space in my head for that. You know, there were times I would just go on drives alone, crying and yelling and screaming, and you just like, you once you let go of some of that stuff, then you can start to focus on the people in your life who you do still have a connection with, and continue to encourage them to foster their own relationship with someone who may have harmed you, understanding that their relationship is a completely different one. And so it's difficult. You know, there's ways to work through these things without necessarily having to use the framework of grace and Christianity. But all of these different frameworks that allow you to deal with the tragedies that happen in your life bring a meaning that you draw from them. It's a reflection of the meaning you find in yourself that is then manifest in how you conduct your life. And different frameworks give you a different tool set to do that. Right. And I'm sure there's certainly a framework that I could have adopted that would have had me raise the ground, allow no room for any way of any interaction, and demonize any attempt that, for example, my children might have to connect with somebody in their life, and to call them wrong for doing those things. And there's a framework where I could do that, but it doesn't have the power of promoting healthy relationships in the world around me. Anyway, that's my take on it.
Yeah, that's really profound. And sometimes things are altered beyond what can be restored back, right? That we can repair. That's maybe the symbolism of the scars can be healed, but it's forever changed. And that's part
And
of
as
it.
the caller pointed out, there's no way of thinking, there's no spiritual existence that's going to eliminate that.
No, none. You cannot bypass it.
All we
Yeah.
can do is find a way to move forward and do what we can within the realm that we have the ability to have influence.
Yeah.
And so anyway, caller, appreciate
All right.
you
Yeah,
posing
thank you so
some
much.
fascinating
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah, great
Take
stuff.
care.
Thank you.
Okay, if you'd like to call in, you can dial 210-422-2222. And let's see if we have any other comments that we can discuss here. And I think you can see the comments as well, Katie, if there's any that you feel inspired to respond to.
I'm just seeing this one. The Christianity didn't invent and doesn't own grace. That's true. Can't
What do you
own.
mean by that?
Well, they say, so that was a comment there, that the very last one. Also, Christianity didn't invent and doesn't own grace. And that's right. Something as powerful as that can't be contained within like any particular belief structure, anything like that. What I would say the Jesus story does, though, is embodies it in an extremely powerful way.
Okay, so if you would like to pose a question to our guest, you can dial 210-422-2222. Trevor congratulates you on some foundational understanding of postmodernism. Some talking heads and politicians who don't have a flippin' clue. Gimpy Geezer says, well, what about Jesus and Satan? Real or fiction to tell a moral tale? I was Lutheran before I joined the LDS. I remember them thinking that Jesus was real.
Yeah, well, for sure, Jesus, I definitely believe Jesus was real. I think historically speaking, Jesus certainly lived. That wasn't made up. And most secular scholars will acknowledge that. The fundamental claim at the heart of Christianity has to do with the resurrection of Jesus. And what we can tell empirically is that the best explanation for the rise of Christianity is that there were people, the early followers of Jesus, who was a Jewish Messiah figure, a Jewish political religious figure, who was embarking on a project to restore the kingdom of Israel. And there were many Messiah figures at the time, that came and went. But that Jesus was one, Jesus of Nazareth was one who came and seemingly failed in his project, was just one of many failed messiahs. But then something that was different about the Jesus followers, the followers of Jesus of Nazareth, is that they said they had these experiences of him being raised from the dead. And so I think historically speaking, we can definitely say that they said that they had those experiences, right? Nothing else sort of explains the rise of Christianity besides that kind of groundedness. And then the question of whether or not Jesus actually did become raised, whether or not Jesus was raised from the dead is one of faith. I do believe that Jesus, that something happened, right? That those disciples experienced something. I don't know exactly what it is. The biblical text in particular is really unclear about what the resurrected body was, what Jesus' resurrected body was. He, sort of comes and goes. He can walk through walls. He can appear or not, so these resurrection appearances aren't as like super straightforward. We don't know what it is. We don't know exactly what his resurrected body is or anything like that. But yeah, I do believe that something happened. And that it had something to do with the the ushering in of a new age of peace and justice. And the rise of Constantine does explain the proliferation of Christianity, but not its founding. To respond to the comment that just down there at the bottom.
The thing that drives, I guess, that comes into my mind with that question is this idea that Satan figure itself, I've heard several people say, didn't actually exist in Jewish religious tradition, and that it serves the role of an enemy. That then we learn in, group psychology dynamics, when you look at, when a group needs cohesion, if you have an enemy, somebody that you can demonize that binds the group together, then it serves an evolutionary purpose in terms of getting a group to, have stronger cohesion. And so that's why in political factions, they'll identify an enemy and then get people around with that. And so Satan kind of serves that role. You brilliantly bring this up in your book. What is made of the Satan figure? Is it a literal person who is an adversary to the purposes of God? Is it a metaphorical representation of our own impulses, which may work against the aspirations or ideals articulated in the person of Christ? How do you see that?
I think of, so this is where I do believe in that there's a spirituality, right? That like spirituality is something, and that there are forces and energies in the world that we can't fully explain empirically or whatever. I don't think that I think you're right when you talk about how the historical development of the notion of Satan sort of evolved. I think that sounds right from what I've read. I think that the way I've sort of come to think of Satan or whatever is I don't think there's a dude somewhere. There's a dude, in the depths of hell, plotting against God. I don't really.
Satan will always be Michael Balaam to me.
Yeah, exactly. I don't with the lovely shiny aprons or whatever. I don't think there's a person, but I do think that there's forces, kind of cosmic energies, forces of evil that exist, that are sometimes bigger than us. How they got there, I don't know. One theory I've read was it's sort of the force of our collective evil creates reverberations out into the world that get bigger and go beyond us. And so that's one piece of it. Do I think that there are, there are impulses in the world that go against justice and grace and goodness and peace and those sorts of things, and sometimes they feel like they have sort of a power all their own. I do think there are spiritual forces, but I don't think that there's a devil with horns somewhere, or a Lucifer floating around with his unembodied minions.
Kind of like spiritual bypassing, I kind of look at the figure of Satan or the entity of Satan, and I try to make sure that I'm not using that as a way to demonize and depersonalize someone, and in a way prevent myself from trying to have a degree of empathy with it. So it's very easy when you hear ideological opponents that you disagree with, and the thing that they're arguing for totally violates your own moral framework, and so you see them as a force of evil.
Yeah, right.
But then when you go and you say, well, let me try to see things from their perspective and understand if what they're doing to them is evil, or if they have some different moral framework which would make what they're doing as good, at least then I can understand their motivations and try to do that. And so far, for the most of the time, when I try to go through that exercise, I can understand, even if I don't agree with it, even if I still hold that what they're doing is going to be harmful to myself, to my loved ones, or to the society as a whole, I can understand where they're coming from, and I can know how they make their arguments in this regard.
Yeah.
And there's a challenging example that I hesitate to even bring up, but there's a researcher, a journalist named Abigail Shrier, who's written a book about how the push to rapidly promote gender transition in children has the potential to be harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And so people who are very concerned about damage and harm to transgender children completely demonize her as hateful and bigoted, and that she's part of the system of cis heteronormativity that is trying to continue to build up the body count of transgender people. And so people who aren't quite sure what to make of this, if they just take those arguments against Abigail Shrier at their face value, then they can say, yes, she's hateful and she's bigoted, she doesn't have anything. But okay, we have to go through this exercise of empathy. Let's now just listen and look at what she's saying and see if she's motivated by hate against transgendered people, or if there's some way that she thinks that she's doing the right thing. And that's where, when you listen to and read her books, you can say, okay, well, she's identified that there are clusters of young women who are at a vulnerable moment in their life, that we see the same epidemiological patterns that you saw before in eating disorders and other things, where there's a psychology element to it that then is being somehow put in this mix, where if you say anything contrary to absolute endorsement of immediate hormone or surgical therapy, then you are demonized. And not only that, but statistically, we're now losing populations of lesbians, because lesbianism is now, for some reason, people who in the past would have become lesbians are becoming transgendered. And so people look at that and they say, what we have is some sort of ideological purging of lesbians, and it's being done without actual medical informed consent. All of the medication and surgical procedures are done off label, and the same sort of standards of medical ethics that we would do have not been done in terms of making sure that we're applying those therapies to the right patients. It's just a long way of saying that there's some serious consideration, some serious thought, and serious stories when you listen to young women who went through this process and eventually decided it wasn't for them for some reason, and they start talking about their own desire to detransition. Then they get demonized by that community much in the same way of other people. So then the red flags of, wait, this is what happens in cults, where you're not allowed to say or think certain things. And so when you start seeing that all these forces are somehow in play there, then it's harder to demonize her and say that she's simply bad. And that's where the demonization, having a Satan figure that exists that you can then blame when things don't agree with how you have, it's lazy. It creates a way for you not to actually empathize with or investigate other perspectives. Regardless, you're not going to agree with everyone that you go to and explore, but at least you have a greater measure of understanding.
Yeah. I don't know too much about the particular case that you brought up, but certainly I think it is one of the hallmarks of our age that we tend to ascribe bad motivations to people and demonize them, right? Make them Satan in a way that probably isn't very helpful.
Yeah. Okay, I'm getting a message that I need to wrap things up. So. It's not from Yu-Gi-Oh, though. It's from other people. Anyway, Katie, thank you so much for taking the time to share a bit of your journey and your thoughts that you express so well in your book, and that you continue to, in your interviews and your discussions here, articulate so well. If you want to learn more about Katie, you can go to her website at katielangston.com. You can find her book on Amazon and Audible. Is there any other place that we can turn people to go to hear more from you?
Yeah, you can you can find the book anywhere, bookshop.org or IndieBound if you rather do independent stuff. And then, but my website's probably great, or the publisher's website is thornbushpress.com.
All right. And in the future, I'm really, really going to encourage you, and I'll provide whatever help and assistance I can. I'd love to see you have a platform like this where you can share your thoughts and your unique perspective in finding a home in Christianity, coming from an upbringing in Mormonism. I think it'd be great for you to take calls and to share some of your perspective there. So everybody look forward to that. We're going to make that happen.
Awesome.
Anyway. All right. Well, until next time then, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff, and we will see you soon.